Okay, hello everyone. I'm sorry if I'm actually using a different format today since I couldn't meet you physically. So I realized that the best thing to do is to make a small movie, a movie for this lecture, and I hope it is clear enough for everyone. In case it's not clear, please do get in touch with me about any aspect of this presentation. Today's lesson is quite straightforward and it's actually reviewing some of the principles we have talked about in the past in previous lectures. And please do get in touch with me if you are not able to understand some parts of it. So let's get started. It's going to be mostly about the development of learner language. Here's the outline. So what we'll do is we'll go through some of the basic questions about what is learner language and to see the benefits behind studying it. And we will see that most of the studies of learner language early on, it was focused on looking at errors. We'll talk finally, or just the last one of the last few points before closing the lecture is talking about the sequences of development of learner language, and finally to look at the L1 influence and learner language, which is something we will talk about across the lecture, but probably will come back more towards the conclusion. So first, asking this general question. Sorry, by the way, for this background noise. Um, there's some construction going on in my neighborhood. So what is learner language? If we go back to some of the basic definition of learner language, which was in fact studied through the term interlanguage by Larry Selinker, it is a learner's developing second language knowledge. A very basic definition. It is a developing system with its interim structure, interim meaning intermediate or somewhere in the middle, rather than an imperfect imitation of the target language, which used to be what was commonly believed in the past, that one's language learner system is an imperfect imitation. And you can understand by the word imitation that this was mostly assumed under the behaviorist school of language acquisition. It is systematic, it is also predictable, but also dynamic, meaning that it is continually evolving. As learners are receiving more input, they are revising their hypotheses about the target language. So it's more of a system which is not stable because it's always being upgraded and changing with time, with more input, and with the revision of the hypotheses. Interlanguage has the following characteristics. First, we know that one part of these characteristics is influenced by the learner's previous learned languages, meaning first language, second language. If they are learning a third language, for example, it's the first and the second language. So all of these systems which are prior to the learning of the target language will influence, of course, learner language. Second is that this learner language has also, of course, characteristics of the target language, of the second language, because it's an evolving system. And finally, what is contained in this learner language is universal properties or characteristics which seem to be neither belonging to the first nor the second, but are properties of universal grammar, general characteristics, or maybe strategies of learning languages which seem to occur in all or most interlanguage systems. So if we summarize with this image or this maybe this caricature, what we have in our interlanguage or in our learner language system is a combination of properties of the L1 or L1s, also properties of the second language being learned, and some general characteristics or universal principles of learning languages. We continue. Why is it worth doing? Because when we study L2 learner language, we are in fact looking at different things. We are looking at what are the types of errors that learners make, and we have explored that when we talked about error analysis, right? We also show or understand how these errors are a diagnostic of the target language that learners are developing. It serves more of an indication or a diagnostic of where they are in their learning language learning process, and it gives us, of course, an indication about how they develop their interlanguage and what factors, in fact, are influencing their interlanguage. Very general, broad things that we explore when we study the second language learner language system. Now, if we think about this following question, we don't really have this as an activity because we are not meeting face to face, but I want you to think about it a little bit for a few minutes. When we talk about studying learner language, we actually can identify some benefits as far as learning is concerned and as far as teaching is concerned. So if we place ourselves from the perspective of a teacher or language teacher, we can actually benefit from the study of learner language. But also, if we are learners of a language, we can also identify some benefits. So please do think about this for a few minutes. If you can brainstorm some thoughts about what are the benefits, both from a teacher perspective and from a learner perspective, of studying learner language. So here is the beginning of an answer, which comes with part 2 of today's lecture. What is the purpose of studying learner language? The study of learner language can help teachers to assess teaching procedures, to assess teaching approaches, to assess teaching methods in the light of what they can reasonably expect to accomplish in the classroom, depending on what stage the learner has reached. They, meaning teachers, can adjust their teaching, can make some modifications in their teaching methods because they have a more understanding of where the learners are in their phases of development. And when we talk about learners, on the other hand, if learners in fact can take a step back and understand the different phases or the different stages of acquisition, whereby they will go through maybe phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and looking at the complexity they will reach in terms of acquisition of morphemes, syntax, word order. If they can see that there is a progression, then they can probably learn or expect or anticipate what the difficulties will be in their learning language learning process. And finally, why it is beneficial: it provides a deeper understanding of errors that second language learners make, and it actually breaks the stereotype that errors are an indication of lack of practice or of transfer from the first language, but rather it can help us understand that when learners make errors, it may be because they are making overgeneralizations and testing their hypotheses, and this can be an indication of progress. Number 3, third part of today's lecture, learner language and errors, since we have talked about errors as indicative of progress. If we go back in history, and some of the things I'm going to talk about now we have already mentioned before, during the 1960s, most people regarded L2 learners' speech as something imperfect, something incorrect, kind of a flawed version of the target language. And this perspective on language learning looks at second language learners being always in kind of a deficit state, never really reaching or attaining the target language, always compared to the speech or to the performance of native speakers. So it's something incorrect. Their errors were believed to be the result of transfer from first language and this we have talked about when we mentioned the famous theory of contrastive analysis. It's not really a theory, but it's more of a model explaining there's transfer that takes place between first and second language systems, and by contrasting the two systems we understand how transfer takes place. And as I just mentioned, contrastive analysis was the basis for identifying the differences between the first and the second language, and for making some provisions or predictions about what will be the difficult areas for second language learners. And it was called CAH, or Contrastive Analysis Hypothesis. So this is the 60s. Now we're going to move to the 70s, or before that, I'm sorry. Let's first identify some of the difficult, not the difficult parts, but some of the problematic parts in contrastive analysis hypothesis. A number of second language acquisition research studies showed that many errors can be explained better in terms of learners' attempts to discover the structure of the language, rather than making errors the end point or the purpose of studying a second language. Errors are rather an indication of how learners are making hypotheses, testing their internal hypotheses of the language, and learning to build a system. Some errors, in fact, are remarkably similar to the kinds of errors made by young L1 learners. For example, when we talk about overgeneralization, we always cite the often recycled example of the use of the regular ed marking of the past, which is also used in irregular verb like I goed to school. So this is consistent across learners, not only in second language acquisition, but it's also a system or maybe a strategy or a technique that is used by first language learners as well in their native language. And why is contrastive analysis hypothesis problematic? If we continue looking at the research and the findings, we can determine that errors are not always bidirectional. And when differences between the first and the second language exist, transfer between the two languages is not automatic. So it's not something that is always going in both ways. Learners also have intuitions that certain features of their first languages are less likely to be transferable than others. For example, they believe that idiomatic or metaphorical expressions cannot simply be translated word for word. So all of those findings point to the fact that there were certain flaws in this development of contrastive analysis hypothesis, and this brings us back to looking at learner language not as a deficit model, not as something that should be contrasted to first language systems, but rather as a system that is evolving in itself and that is constantly testing hypotheses. Now, if we move to a bit later, 10 years later, following contrastive analysis, during the 1970s, we noticed that the analysis of learner language aimed at discovering what learners actually know about their target language. And one of the big things during this period, which we also talked about, moving from a focus on contrastive analysis and L1 transfer, there was a paradigm shift to the understanding of the rules and patterns of the target language through the errors that learners make. And in this period, error analysis replaced contrastive analysis. And it did not really set out to predict L2 learners' errors. Rather, what was aimed by the focus on error analysis was to discover and describe different kinds of errors in order for people to make taxonomies, lists, and this was aimed to, in fact, understand how learners process the second language. So error analysis became quite a big thing in the 70s, and it was based on the assumption that L2 learner language is a system in its own right, independent from the first language system, and of course one which is also rule governed and predictable. I have for the next slide, as you will see, a picture of a story by Jeff Hale called The Great Toy Robbery. You can check in the description of the PowerPoint. There's an activity that I'm suggesting, and there's a hyperlink if you click on the image that will lead you to the movie. Why is this movie important? Because in fact it has been used by second language acquisition researchers to analyze the recollection of a story. So in fact the activity proceeded in this way. There was a set of students, or one student, who watched the video while another student was outside the room, and when the other student came in the room, the first student was asked to describe the short movie to the second student. Based on this activity, which is quite interesting and which we could replicate or maybe try again, if you are interested in error analysis, you could use it with a group of students. So they were asked, some students were asked to look at the story, and after viewing the film, they were in fact asked to retell the story in writing, as if they were telling it to someone who had not seen the film. So in this situation here, we had a French-speaking secondary school student and a Chinese-speaking adult learner. Both, of course, were learners of English as a second language. And following the activity, we had the data collected by Lightbound and Parkman, which was recollection in writing. And as you will see in the next slide, we have learner 1, and you can see some characteristics of French errors from French learners of English, and learner 2 is errors which are more symptomatic of Chinese learners of English. So this is quite an interesting exercise that we can do in class, whether we want to do it as a writing task or as a speaking task. This will actually give us a lot of indications about spontaneous written performance, and also look at some of the typical errors which will come back in either spoken mode or written mode. In this specific part of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about some of the errors that we commonly encounter and that are really characteristic or maybe symptomatic of learner language. We have what we call developmental errors, and I want to open a small parenthesis here that some of these errors might sound to you to be similar, but they are classified under different labels. So the first type of error is called developmental error, and this type of error might very well be made by children acquiring their L1. So they can be equally made by first language learners or second language learners. For example, a cowboy go, not marking the third person on the verb form. The second type is what we call overgeneralization errors, and we are quite familiar with these. So these errors are caused by trying to use a rule in a context where it does not belong. Example, they plays toys in the bar, she buyed a dress. So consistently applying the same verb form across different situations, including in cases where it does not fit. A third context of errors or scenarios of errors that are quite common in language, in learner language, is what we call simplification errors. These errors are caused by simplifying or leaving out some elements. For example, when learners make all the verbs have the same form regardless of person, number, or tense. Although this sounds a bit like the previous two types, but is still one distinct category of learner language and errors, or errors in learner language. Fourth is the misuse of formulaic expressions, um, saying I don't have a pen to write instead of the correct form, which is ending with a preposition with. I don't have a pen to write with. And some of those errors, in fact, will stay frozen and will remain really fossilized for a long time. Typically, we see these errors across different learners from different L1 backgrounds. A final type is called interference errors, and this is a small parenthesis that we open looking back at the work done in the field of transfer from first language acquisition. So we have, for instance, Chinese learners of English who will say things like on the back of his body has big packet, which is sometimes a direct example of transfer from the first language Chinese, the formulation being in Chinese the same or comparatively similar, or in the case of other languages saying surprises, I have a surprise for you, when the person means I have a present for you, meaning the actual object, the present, but saying surprise, I have a surprise, surprises for present in the plural form. Now continuing with learner language and errors, in a discussion of error analysis, why is it beneficial for us as researchers or as students? It helps us to describe some of the systematic aspects of learner language, because we will see that across different situations, different scenarios, regardless of the first language, there is a systematic aspect to errors which are consistently similar regardless of the first language of the learner. And there are some constraints, however, because these errors do not always give us a clear idea into what are the causes for the errors and why do learners do these things the way they do. Because first, it is very often difficult to determine the source, the origin of the error. Why does it arise in the first place? Secondly, learners sometimes avoid using certain features of language, meaning that when they know that they are going to use a syntactic structure which is convoluted or difficult, they either simplify it or make a strategy of avoidance altogether. They do not use it just because they know they might make a mistake. So they rely on these avoidance strategies. So it's sometimes errors are not always indicative of the whole picture. And the avoidance of a particular feature will be difficult to observe, but it may also be part of the learner's systematic L2 performance, because it becomes something which is a strategy that learners use. Now I'm going to move on to talk about the fourth part of today's lecture, which is developmental sequences. And second language acquisition research has revealed that L2 learners, like also first language learners, they go through similar sequences of development. And in a given language, many of these developmental sequences are quite similar, whether we are talking about first language or second language learners. It's not always the case that the L2 features, which are heard or read most frequently, are easier to learn. So it's not because a structure that is encountered very frequently, either in the input or in the communication patterns that learners get exposed to, that those structures necessarily would be easier to acquire, although they are the most frequent ones. So sometimes we can use the examples of the articles a and the, that sometimes learners will have a hard time assigning to the right word or noun, although articles are quite common in the English language and they are really part of the daily input that the learners will get exposed to. Even among second language learners from different first languages and different environments, many of these sequences are quite consistent, are quite similar, and are quite systematic. So it shows us that there must be some universal principles involved here in the developmental sequences. Now, I want to give you some examples about particular areas of language where we notice some developmental sequences, and those examples will be taken from the following four categories. First, grammatical morphemes. Second, negation. Third, questions. Fourth, relative clauses, and there is a fifth one, which is a reference to past. So let us start with the first one, grammatical morphemes. Learners are often more accurate, it is a fact, and based on many studies in second language acquisition, it has been found that learners are more accurate in using the plural s form, and they really have a hard time, comparatively speaking, assigning the possessive s. It seems that the possessive s is a little bit more tricky for learners, for second language learners. So there is a prediction, or maybe there are some expectations in terms of the developmental sequences, that the plural form will be acquired and mastered earlier than the possessive s. Also, often learners are more accurate in using the ing form when compared to the past ed marker, the past tense. These are just some facts based on research, and they also give us some indication whether we are teachers or learners of the areas of difficulty for learners interlanguage and progression in their second language acquisition, of what are the things they will probably master first. Number 3 is the learner's first language will have some effect on the accuracy order of grammatical morphemes, meaning if there is a direct transfer because the two languages, whether the first or the second, will have a similar word order, for example, or will have similar morphemes grammatically. However, it is not always entirely determined by the learner's first language. Now that sounds like an interesting point, right? There are some strong patterns of similarity among learners of different L1 backgrounds. Here again, this justifies the fact that although some learners from a first similar L1 background, meaning typologically the first language that learners have, let's take the case of two learners, one with L1 background is Portuguese, second one is Spanish. Although these two languages are similar, coming to the penultimate point, although they are similar, this is the accuracy of the order of grammatical morphemes is not entirely determined by the first language similarity, and in fact it's just because we are identifying some universal principles that show us that there is a system in place, or there are some grammatical developments that proceed through sequences, that learners will get exposed to things and they will progressively acquire grammar in sequences or in different phases, which are predictable and consistent. Now, if we talk about negation, and if we look at how learners acquire the different phases in learning negation, the acquisition of negative sentences by second language learners follow a path that is pretty much identical to the stages in first language acquisition. However, sometimes this may be a bit different depending on the nature of the first language. There might be languages which have a different system, different typology of negations, but consistently the acquisition of negations is systematic, and across all different scenarios of first languages is pretty much similar. So we have the following stages in forming negatives. The first stage is by using the no before the verb or noun. It's pretty simple. Second stage, there is the inclusion or the emergence of don't, followed by the use of are, is, and can in combination with not. And finally, in stage 4, we have a more complex use of negatives with the auxiliary verbs with not that agree with tense person and a number. Now let's go to questions. Questions involve both yes/no questions and WH questions. And a little bit like negation, they are similar in most respects to L1 acquisition. When we talk about L2 and L1 acquisition, the sequence, the developmental sequences of the acquisition of questions is similar, whether it is for first or second language learners. However, sometimes, as I explained in the past, we have languages where we have fronting of the WH word for WH questions, but we also have different types of languages, especially Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Thai, where this WH word stays inside you and it is not moved. So sometimes they might be affected to some degree by their first languages. The stages of forming questions, we have different stages, pretty much 6 stages overall. But if we look at the first 3 stages, for example, we have the stage 1, where single words or sentence fragments are used to express questions. So for example, if we ask someone, do you want tea? It will be like tea with a rising intonation, or one tea. Very simple sequences. Stage 2 is declarative word order without fronting or inversion. You want tea, the way a declarative statement or sentence is achieved. And of course, again, maybe we will have a rising intonation to suggest a question. Stage 3, we have fronting, where we have a WH fronting but no inversion. And in the case of yes no questions, we have do fronting, like do you want tea? Of course, there are more stages, 4, 5, and 6, where learners typically will develop more advanced knowledge of the WH questions or yes no questions, and these are consistent and they are characteristic of learner language again. Now let's go to relative clauses, and I want you to think about the following keyword: accessibility hierarchy. There has been a lot of studies performed on accessibility hierarchy. There is a hierarchy in the acquisition of relative clauses, and here accessibility means whether we have accessibility to these relative clauses in the input in order for learners to learn them. So typically, if you look at the following division or maybe sequence of relative clauses, we start with subject relative clauses down to what we call object of comparison relative clauses. What does this mean? It means that whether it is first language learners or second language learners, they typically go through the same phases, acquiring all of those relative clauses, but they will start by the easiest type of relative clause, the subject type. The girl who was sick went home. They will never produce in their output or in their production of language relative clauses like possessive relative clauses before first having subject type or direct object type. So there is a suggestion that you can never expect a learner to have knowledge of more complex relative clauses if they have not acquired or learned the easy ones, which are at the top end of the sequences. Now, reference to the past means that learners are talking about past events and recollecting memories and talking about the past when sharing stories, for example. How does it proceed? How do they learn to talk about the past? If we talk about early learners or beginners, they may simply refer to events in the order in which they occurred, sometimes not changing the structure of verbs. So we have, for example, the following case: my son come, he work in restaurant, he don't like his boss. No marking of the past, but the sequence of events follows a chronological order of how things happened in real life. Then later on, they start to attach a grammatical morpheme which shows that the verb is marked for the past. After they begin marking past tense on verbs, learners may still make errors such as overgeneralization of the regular ed ending. For instance, John worked in the bank, that's pretty fine, but they would also say things like he rided a bicycle. So that's the second phase. Now we go to other phases more advanced in the developmental sequence of learner language. They are more likely to mark past tense on some verbs. This is found from research findings that typically learners will have an easier time marking action verbs when compared to state verbs. Action verbs are things like I broke the vase, he fixed the car. So this is easy for learners to make marking of past tense. But when it comes to she seemed happy or my father belonged to the club, state verbs, it seems that it's a bit more difficult for them to mark the past tense. And finally, the last phase is when learners find it easier to mark more complex past tense structures, like, for example, completed events, or talking about things which haven't been totally completed when we don't have a clear end point. For example, he stays there for a week. He stayed there for a week. That's a completed event. But I want to know how he learned English. This is something which is still in progress. He is still learning English. So the first type of sentence where the event has been completed for learners of a second language like English they would usually have a easier time marking the past when compared to the second type where the action is still being done or not complete. So this is just based on a series of studies, and it gives us an indication on the developmental sequences for language learners and characteristic of either interlanguage or learner language. So as a conclusion to this part on developmental sequences, we can say that research has proven that there are in fact systematic and predictable developmental stages which have been identified through empirical research on second language acquisition. However, when we talk about developmental sequences, it is important to emphasize that these stages are not like closed rooms where learners will move from one room once they have completed a stage to another room. However, it is more common sometimes that learners will produce sentences typical of several different stages. Therefore, it is better to think of a stage as being characterized by the emergence or the increasing frequency of a particular form rather than by the total disappearance of an earliest one. Finally, even for a more advanced learner, conditions of stress or complexity, if they are faced with stressful conditions or if they have complex, difficult language in a communication or in interaction, they can cause them sometimes to slip back to an earlier stage. This is showing us that these stages are more negotiated and they are not like closed rooms. We come now to the last part of today's lecture, which is the first language influence and learner language. We have, of course, discussed earlier and in previous lectures that learners' knowledge of their first language will optimize or help them to learn the parts of the L2 that are similar to the first language. In case of similarity, then there will be a promotion or enhancement of the second language learning process. And the first language may interact with learners' developmental sequences of the L2. Some people have tried to explain why avoidance takes place, meaning why do learners sometimes avoid difficult structures or why do they rely on easy ways of communicating? Well, some people have said that this is probably associated with learners' perception that one feature in their second language is still distant or too different from their first language, therefore they use strategies of avoidance. So this is one possibility, or this is one hypothesis that help people understand or make sense of this strategy of avoidance. Now, there are two areas of language use and language learning, namely the use of idioms, or idiomatic expressions, and metaphors, where learners will be conscious or aware that those have their own attributes or they are unique to each language. So each language will have their distinct use of idioms and metaphorical expressions, which are sometimes very culture specific. Therefore, the L1 transfer of these will seldom happen. Finally, when learners' interlanguage form does not cause any problem in communication, so meaning that although they use some forms which are still not fully symptomatic or which are not fully part of the target language, and despite their use of these simplified forms or ungrammatical forms, they still can get their meanings across. Sometimes this is why fossilization happens. So this is explaining in fact to us why fossilization takes place. It is because some forms in the learner's language do not cause any difficulty for them to communicate with others. As a summary for today's lecture, a few points to keep in mind or to take away is that researchers have found that learners who receive grammar-based instruction still will pass through the same developmental sequences and make the same types of errors as those who acquire language in a natural setting. So whether it is a setting which is artificial, meaning classroom, where learners will receive grammar instruction, so this is explicit teaching of grammar, or whether they will learn it in a natural setting, they will still go through the same developmental sequences. Secondly, research has also shown us that second language learners from different first language backgrounds, meaning regardless of the native language that they have, they will often make the same kind of errors when learning the second language. Number 3 is that the transfer of patterns from the first language is only one of the major sources of error. So it was assumed in the 60s that the reason why errors happen is because there is a negative transfer from the first to the second language. But in fact, we know now that there are other causes for errors, like the ones we have talked about in this lecture, meaning developmental, overgeneralization, and other types of errors. And finally, interlanguage errors show us something interesting. They show us that learners are discovering the structure of the target language rather than just attempting to transfer their first language patterns. So they are playing, whether consciously or unconsciously, with the language, trying to make hypotheses, trying to get a sense of the second language structure. And that is why we have interlanguage errors. So this is what I have for you for the lecture. For next time, I'd like you to read the chapter by Susan Gass, chapter 6. We will continue with a new topic. It is called individual differences. And of course, we will continue also with the presentations, and we'll try to have as many presentations as possible because we want to complete them before the semester ends. Thank you very much for your attention.